can't start the sharing you can't start recording while you're sharing the screen. Okay, so but if you've missed saying Havdalah on Saturday night, you can still say it through Tuesday.
Okay.
Now we're getting into, well, is that an accurate recitation of what Rava actually said? Okay, Aimar began this teaching of Rava in this amended formulation. Rava said, the halacha is that one who tasted food before Kiddush may recite Kiddush, and one who tasted food before Havdalah may recite Havdalah. And one who did not recite Kiddush on Shabbat Eve at night may recite Kiddush anytime during the entire day. One who did not recite Havdalah at the conclusion of Shabbat may recite Havdalah anytime during the entire day of Sunday, but no later. Okay, so Amemar's amended version. And what this means is that, these were passed down orally, right? So maybe it's misremembered, right? So the vis-a-vis, the Kiddush is still the same, but the vis-a-vis Havdalah, according to Amemar, Rava said only through Sunday, okay, not through Tuesday. Okay.
I mean, well, that sounds more palatable and consistent, that you're not put it off more than 24 hours. I mean, It's arbitrary too. You could say noon on Sunday. But,
right. You could. I mean, having said that, I mean, again, you're not supposed to eat before you say Havdalah, right? But on the other hand, I mean, as I said, you're not allowed to do malacha before you do Havdalah, right? But now you're caught up in a circular problem, right? Because part of saying Havdalah is lighting the Havdalah candle.
Right.
Right. And lighting the Havdalah candle is malacha. Right. But that's why you have that paragraph in Mariv on Saturday night. Right. Okay. And that's also that's also Havdalah. Okay, so the point is, you say that paragraph, and now you've said Havdalah, and that allows you to do the malacha.
Okay.
Right. Otherwise, right, like I said, you're caught up in a circular problem. Right. I can't eat until I've said Havdalah. I can't do malacha until I've said Havdalah, but I can't say Havdalah and not do malacha. So that's what that paragraph is at the end of Shabbat and festival.
Okay.
All right. The Gemara relates that Mar Yanuka, the younger Mar, and Mar Kashisha, the elder Mar, both sons of Rav Chisda. Okay, so apparently Rav Chisda had two sons who were both named Mar, known as Mar. But Mar is not a name. Mar is a title. It means sir or mister.
Right.
Okay. So they both said to Rav Ashi, once Amemar, from the last paragraph, happened to come to our place and we did not have wine for Havdalah. We brought him beer and he did not recite Havdalah, and he passed the night fasting, as it is prohibited to eat before Havdalah. Okay, so this Amemar guy is visiting Saturday night. We didn't have wine. We brought him beer. He didn't recite Havdalah, and he fasted all night, right? Because he feels you can't eat until you said Havdalah.
Oh, okay.
Right? But, I mean, what's the issue? What's the point being made here? I mean, why doesn't Amemar just make Havdalah on beer?
Because you can only make it on wine.
Well, he
Yeah.
holds that you can only make it on wine.
Okay.
All right, let's put it that way. He holds that you can only make it on wine. They didn't have any wine. They brought him beer. No thanks. And he wouldn't eat. Okay, so the next day we exerted ourselves and brought him wine, and he recited Havdalah and tasted some food, right? So I don't know how they found some wine in the neighborhood.
Mhm.
They went to the county store, whatever, and they exerted themselves. They found some wine. He made Havdalah and he ate, and they felt bad, right? Because he fasted all night because they didn't have wine. The next year, he again happened to come to our place. Once again, we did not have wine and we brought him beer. He said, if it is so difficult to obtain wine in your place, beer is the wine of the province. He recited Havdalah over the beer and tasted some food. Okay, so, I mean, right, Amemar, in other words, I guess, well, what's going on here?
Well, it's a practical solution. Well, I think he wanted to be able to say Havdalah and taste some food, so you have to improvise, and beer
Right,
becomes the wine in that situation.
right, but he also, I mean, he concluded, I mean, I'm thinking that in year one, he says, oh, these lazy schleppers, why couldn't they bring some wine, right?
Right,
But the next year, I mean, they already know, right? That, I mean,
right.
so, and they still didn't have any wine. So he realized that it wasn't just them being like lazy, that it was really hard to find wine, right? And this is, I mean, one of the things I pointed this out before is that you will find in quite a few places where the Mishnah insists on wine
Mhm.
and the Gemara says wine or some other alcoholic beverage, or wine or some other beverage, right? And it's a reflection on the fact that the Mishnah is from Eretz Yisrael and the Gemara is from Bavel, right? And wine, I mean, Eretz Yisrael is a Mediterranean climate, right? Wine is plentiful. Bavel is the desert, right? I mean, and I can tell you, I mean, you mentioned kibbutz before, right? I lived on a kibbutz for 2 years in the Arava. Okay, so way south in Israel on the Jordanian border. Okay, dates, everybody in that part of the country grows dates. It's easy to grow dates in that climate. It's not so easy to grow grapes. Okay, our kibbutz had the only vineyard that was that far south. Okay, and it was done. I mean, one of the roles of kibbutzim, at least in the 80s and before, I don't know today, was also like the government would pay a kibbutz to try some agricultural experiment, right? So the experiment was, is it really possible to grow grapes in this climate or not?
Mhm.
Okay, and we succeeded. Now they were table grapes; they were not wine grapes, right? But actually, I mean, and people came from all over the world to study our vineyard.
Mm.
You know, people in similar climates. Could you actually grow grapes or not? Right? So, so it's easy for the Tanaim to say it must be wine, right? But for the Moraim, they had to be practical and realize that wine wasn't always that available, right? So Amemar says essentially, all right, so beer is your equivalent of wine, right? And so he allowed to recite Havdalah over beer. Now, it's interesting. I mean, the sort of, and I'm not sure how we got to this point, frankly, right? But it is actually not required to say Havdalah over wine. You can say Havdalah over the term here that that Amemar use is Hamar Medina. If you look at the next to the last line on the Hebrew,
Yeah.
Hamar Medina, which all right, so they translate here's the wine of the province, but I've usually heard Hamar Medina translated as the local beverage of choice. Okay, and in point of fact, you can recite Havdalah over beer if you want to, over whiskey if you want to. It doesn't have to be wine. I mean, one cool thing is to say Havdalah over like a very high proof vodka or whiskey or something. And then like, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but then you pour out the extra and when you douse the candle, it, it creates like a Havdalah flambe. It's cool. And kids find it fun. Okay. So the Gemara notes that one may learn from Amemar's conduct 3 halachot. Learn from it that one who recites Havdalah in the prayer service must recite Havdalah again over a cup, right? As Amemar had presumably recited the paragraph of Havdalah in his Amida prayer, right? That's what I was saying. That's that paragraph that appears in Mari for Saturday night. That's Havdalah. And the whole purpose of that is to allow you to light the Havdalah candle, right?
Okay.
But what the Gemara here is saying is that you're not done, right? Even though you said Havdalah in your Amida, you still have to say the Havdalah over a cup. And learn from it that it's prohibited for a person to eat before he recites Havdalah, right? At least that's what Amemar holds, because he wouldn't recite Havdalah over beer, and he didn't eat. So they made special effort to go find him someone.
Okay.
All right. And learn from it that one who did not recite Havdalah at the conclusion of Shabbat may recite Havdalah anytime during the entire week, i.e. during the first 3 days of the week. I'm not sure how you learn that third thing from Amemar's contact, but whatever. Okay. Now we get to the question of Havdalah over beer. Right, the Gemara addresses this issue at greater length. Rav Huna raised a dilemma before Rav Hizda. What is the halacha with regard to whether it is permitted to recite Kiddush over date beer? Okay. He said, now if we're with regard to barley beer, fig beer, and beer produced from berries, I raised the dilemma before Rav as to whether or not they may be used for Kiddush. And Rav had previously raised this dilemma before Rabbi Hia, and Rabbi Hia had inquired of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and did not resolve it for him, as he could not find a source that clearly permits it. Is it necessary to say that date beer, which is inferior to those other types of beer, may not be used for Kiddush? Okay, so now we have a chain of tradition, right, going all the way back to Yehuda Hanasi, right, who is the codifier of the Mishnah, right? So there's no greater authority than Yehuda Hanasi, right? And they asked him, can you say Havdalah over barley beer or fig beer or berry beer? And Rabbi Yehuda Anasi could not resolve it for him. Okay, he didn't say no, but he didn't say yes, right? Because he couldn't find a source that clearly permits it, right? So if we can't find a source to permit all these other beers, then date beer, which is inferior, for sure can't be used for Kiddush. Okay, now I'm not such an expert. I don't know why date beer is inferior. I mean, now having said that, barley beer, like, when we say beer, I mean, I don't know, if what you know about beer, but whether you're a beer drinker or not, but your standard beer is made from barley,
Right.
right? I mean, and if they say, oh, it's a wheat beer, it's not, I mean, it's still mostly barley, but it has some wheat as well. But date beer is inferior. Now, to me, I mean, this raises a kind of methodological question, right? As to how you determine, and I'd be interested in your perspective on this vis-a-vis like secular law, right? I mean, are things permitted unless they're explicitly forbidden, or are they forbidden unless they're explicitly permitted? Right. And I mean, you see this play out sometimes, when I mean, between rabbis, where somebody will say, yeah, this is allowed. And some other rabbi will say, well, what's your source that says it's allowed?
Mhm.
Right. And I'll respond, what's your source that says it's not allowed?
Mhm.
Right. I mean, but it's a methodological question. And I'm not sure. I mean, I guess really in secular law, things are allowed unless they're explicitly forbidden,
Yes, I think so.
right? I mean,
I think so.
maybe with a tort, it's less clear. But for a crime, I think you would need to have, something that explicitly forbids it, right? I mean, at least by
Okay.
analogy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there may be no specific law that says, you can't murder somebody in this specific way, right?
Mhm.
But murder's murder. I mean, the
Right.
method is left determinative.
So the reference to these different kind of beers, do you think again that's a reflection of the local agriculture, what was available?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, um, yeah, I mean, because again, I mean, I don't know enough about I mean, here's what I do know, okay? They grew barley in Egypt and they brewed barley beer, right? I don't think that they did they make wine in Egypt? I'm not sure. But clearly, I mean, dates are common in Babylonia, right? So date beer would be relatively easy to make. I mean, although what's interesting, I mean, we would, I mean, in contemporary English parlance, we would not say date beer. We would say date wine. Okay, because um, as somebody who knows a lot about brewing and fermenting and so on and so forth, right? I mean, like the liquid that whiskey is made from is called beer. Okay. Because the definition of beer is fermented grain, right? And the definition of wine is fermented fruit.
Mhm.
So that in English, I mean, like I say, we would not talk about date beer or apple beer or cherry beer, right? It's apple wine or cherry wine, right?
Yeah.
And then if you distill beer, you get whiskey. If you distill wine, you get brandy,
Okay.
right? So you could have cherry brandy or date brandy or whatever. But you wouldn't have, apple whiskey or date whiskey. So, but obviously, their terminology was different.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure exactly why they thought that date beer is inferior. I don't know. Those who heard this response understood from it that it is Kiddush that one might not recite over it, but one may recite Havdalah over date beer. Okay, because this is true. I mean, you can't say Kiddush over beer or whiskey, right? You can say Havdalah over beer or whiskey, but you can't say Kiddush over beer or whiskey, right? And therefore, if you don't have wine, you actually say Kiddush over bread,
Okay.
not over beer or whiskey, because beer or whiskey, I guess, is considered inferior. Okay. So it's Kiddush that you can't recite over it, but you can recite Havdalah over date beer, right? Rav Chisda said to them that Rav said as follows: just as one may not recite Kiddush over date beer, so one may not recite Havdalah over it. It was also stated that Rav Tachalifa bar Avimi said that Shmuel said, just as one may not recite Kiddush over date beer, so one may not recite Havdalah over it. So the status of date beer for Havdalah is still not clear. Okay, but we then read that Levi sent Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi a beer of 13 soakings. Okay, what is a beer of 13 soakings? 13 batches of dates had been soaked in water until it had thoroughly absorbed the taste of the dates, and this was considered a high quality beer. Okay, so I guess what makes like your standard like bottom shelf date beer inferior is that it doesn't taste like much, right? But if you have the beer of 13 soakings, right? So the date must, the date water, right, is highly concentrated, right? So you've got this date water or date must, and then you ferment it, and this is now considered a high quality beer. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi tasted it, and it was especially pleasant. He said, a beer like this is fit to recite Kiddush over and to say upon it all the songs and praises in the world, as it is as good as wine. At night, it disrupted his digestion and caused him pain. He said it pains on the one hand and soothes on the other. Okay. So apparently, like beer, according to the Amoraim, beer is bad for the digestion. Okay. It might taste good, but it'll make you sick afterwards. Okay?
Okay.
So Rav Yosef said, I will take a vow in public which cannot be nullified, that I will not drink beer due to its negative effects, despite the fact that beer was a popular beverage in Babylonia. Rava said, I would rather drink water used for soaking flax, and I will not drink beer. Okay, and Rava said, one who recites Kiddush over beer, his regular drink should be beer, right? In other words, the fitting punishment for one who recites Kiddush over beer, the poor man's drink, is to become poor yourself, and you have to drink beer on a regular basis. The Gemara relates that Rav was found by Rav Huna reciting Kiddush over beer. He said to him, Abba, Rav's first name, has started to acquire coins with beer. Rav recently began selling beer. It has become his favorite beverage to the extent that he uses it for Kiddush. Okay, so he's a beer merchant. Of course, he's going to use it for Kiddush because he's now so fond of beer. Okay. Now, the sages taught, so this is a baraita. Tanu Rabbanan means it's a baraita, okay, which means it's in Mishnaic Hebrew, but it's not actually found in the Mishnah. Okay. One may recite Kiddush only over wine, and one may recite blessings only over wine. And so the Gemara expresses surprise. Is that to say that one does not say the blessing by whose word all things Shahakal came to be over beer and water? Right? If you can't say blessings over beer, right, or over water, then what do you do when you drink beer or water, which is Shahakal? So Abaye says, no, that you misunderstood the Baraita. This is what the Baraita is saying. One only says, bring a cup of blessing to recite the blessing of grace after meals over wine. Okay, so there was a practice of reciting Birkat Hamazon over a cup of wine, right? And there are two places where we see a remnant of that practice. One is the third cup of wine at the Seder, right? Is the Koshel Bracha. We say Birkat Hamazon over a cup of wine, right? And the other place where there's still a reflection of that practice is in the Catholic Mass, right? I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to a Catholic Mass.
No.
Okay, but I mean, the framing of the Catholic Mass is the Last Supper. Okay, which whether it was a Passover Seder or not, okay, and that's open to dispute, it was certainly a Jewish meal, right? So the priest consecrates the bread. Okay, now I'm going to think. Now, so this is the opposite order, right? Because we do wine and then bread, right?
Okay.
But the priest consecrates the bread, and he says, and he gave you thanks and praise, and he distributed to all those pleasant and said, take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body. Right. And then after that, the priest, he elevates the chalice and he says, when supper was ended, he took the cup. Again, he gave you thanks and praise. Okay. And one time when I was at a Catholic Mass, I said, Birkat Hamazon al Hakos. Right? Like, when supper was ended, he took the cup again, he gave you thanks and praise. right? So the Catholic Mass has a reflection of this practice, which certainly in Jesus's time would have been done, but is not really that widespread, among contemporary Jews, except at the Passover Seder. Okay. So the Baraita is saying, right, the Birkat Hamazon al Hakos, that has to be wine. Not saying you don't say Shehakol before you drink beer or Shehakol before you drink wine. Of course you do. Okay. The rabbis taught in the Baraita, one may not recite Kiddush over beer. In the name of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, they said that one may recite Kiddush over beer. Okay, so we leave this unresolved. Okay. They leave it unresolved. Okay, but now the halacha that you have to, if you say Kiddush, you have to drink from the cup, right? I mean, which seems self-evident, right? The Gemara states that one fulfills the mitzvah of Kiddush by tasting any amount of wine. Rabbi Yosef, son of Yehuda, says that one must drink at least a cheekful, right? I mean, we were discussing this before, like what is, when it says eat, how much, right? When it says drink, also how much, at least a cheekful. One, Rav Huna said that Rav said, and Rav Gidel from the city of Neresh likewise teaches, one who recites Kiddush and tastes a cheekful has fulfilled his obligation, and if not, he has not fulfilled his obligation. Okay. I'm going to skip the next paragraph because it bogging down on like which Rav Gidel and so on and so forth, and I want to get back to what we originally started, right? Which is the Mishnah that adjacent to Mincha time on Erev Pesach, we are not allowed to eat. Okay. Samuch lemincha, right? Adjacent to Mincha time, a dilemma was raised before the sages in the study hall. Did we learn in the Mishnah that it's prohibited to eat adjacent to the time of the greater Mincha, Mincha Gedola, which is half an hour after midday? Or perhaps we learned in the Mishnah that it is prohibited to eat adjacent to the time of the lesser Mincha, Mincha Katana, 2.5 hours before sunset, right? In other words, Mincha, we still don't know exactly what that means, right? So Mincha Gedola is half an hour after midday. Okay, so we'll say, for sake of argument, half an hour after noon, right? But it's not, I mean, you understand that when we're talking about halachic times, I mean, obviously, first of all, people weren't walking around wearing watches, right? But an hour of halachic time is not necessarily 60 minutes. Okay. I mean, in fact, it is only 60 minutes on the equinox. All right. An hour is 1/12 of the time between sunrise and dusk. Okay. So, like right now, an hour, is 50 some odd minutes. Right. And in the summer, an hour is 70 some odd minutes. Right. But if we are told that adjacent to Mincha we can't eat, or we're talking about Mincha Gedola, okay, which means a half hour after midday, after noon, or Mincha Katana, 2.5 hours before sunset. right? And if we're not allowed to eat adjacent to mincha katana, that's not really a big deal, right? You're not really going that long without food.
Right.
Okay. The Gemara, did we learn in the Mishnah that it's prohibited to eat adjacent to the time of the greater mincha? And this is because of the Paschal lamb, lest one come to be drawn after the meal and spend a long time eating, as was typical for large meal. And he will end up refraining from performing the Paschal lamb. I have to go over into 107b. Okay, so if it's because of the past, right? So the concern may be if we're talking about the greater mincha, right, which means the cutoff time is later in the day. All right, if the cutoff time is later in the day, right, and if the cutoff time is 2.5 hours before sunset, right, well, sometimes people have long meals, right? And if the cutoff time is 2.5 hours over sunset, then people might not sacrifice the Paschal lamb. Okay, now either because they're like, oh, I just ate, I'm not hungry, right? Or because they're still eating and haven't gotten around to the sacrifice. Okay, or is it adjacent to the lesser mincha? And the reason for the prohibition is due to matzah. All right, if one eats shortly before nightfall, perhaps he will come to eat matzah as an act of excessive eating when one forces himself to eat despite the fact that he has no desire to do so, right? So the question is, are we worried about the Paschal lamb or are we worried about matzah, right? Because if you've eaten later in the day, right? Because we've learned this already in the Mishnah, right? That they want you to eat matzah when you're hungry, right? Because they want you to eat it with enthusiasm and not simply like forcing yourself to do so because it's a mitzvah, right? Because you should perform mitzvot joyfully, right? And not just, I mean, obviously, if it's a mitzvah, you should do it regardless of what your attitude is, right? But optimally, right, you should do it joyfully, right? Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, right? Serve the Lord joyfully.
But you're not required to eat the matzah until the Seder, correct?
Right. Right. No, in fact, you're not allowed to eat matzah
right.
before the Seder.
Seder.
Right? You're not allowed to eat matzah before the Seder because you have to fulfill the mitzvah joyfully. Right? Now, look, I mean, the fact of the matter is that for most of us, we're not so stringent about time as we should be.
Yes.
Right? Because the mitzvah is to eat matzah on Pesach.
Right.
Right? And a lot of us start our Seder before dark. Right? I mean, especially if you've got kids or grandkids and whatever. I mean, you know, but really, I mean, not only are you not fulfilling the mitzvah if you've eaten your mitzvah matzah before dark, I mean, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah, and in fact, you've actually committed a sin, right? By eating matzah before Pesach, which you're not allowed to do. Ravina said, come and hear a solution from a Baraita. Even King Agrippa, who regularly eats every day at 9 hours, i.e. 3 hours before sunset, on the day of Passover Eve, he may not eat until dark. Okay, so King Agrippa's, right, he didn't eat until dark, even though he normally, as a king, eats like earlier. Okay, Ravina infers from this Baraita, granted, if you say that we learned in the Mishnah that it is prohibited to eat adjacent to the lesser mincha, that is why his actions are accounted to the greatness of Agrippa's, as he refrained from eating despite the fact that the prohibition had not yet gone into effect. However, if you say that we learned in the Mishnah that one may not eat adjacent to the greater mincha, what is the greatness of Agrippa? The prohibition against eating had already taken effect at the outset right after midday. Rather, it must be that we learned that is prohibited adjacent to eat to the lesser mincha, and Agrippa was praised for changing his regular routine despite the fact that he was not obligated to do so. Okay, I have to confess, I'm not sure I understand this, so we'll go back to this in 2 weeks.
Okay.
All right. And I'll understand it better. All right. Stop share.
Could you explain again what the Baraita is versus other authorities?
Yeah, okay. A Baraita. Okay, so the word Baraita means outside. Okay, so it's outside the canon of the Mishnah,
Okay.
right? But there's two different types of authorities in the Mishnah. There's Tanaim and there's Amoraim. Okay, and I mean Tana and Mishnah. All right, Tana is Aramaic, Mishnah is Hebrew. Okay, a shin becomes a tav in Aramaic a lot, like shalosh in Aramaic is tlat. Okay, so a Tana is a rabbi who is quoted in the Mishnah. Okay, and an Amara, and actually Amar and Gamar, it's the same. It's Hebrew versus Aramaic. Okay, so an Amara is a rabbi who's quoted in the Gemara but not in the Mishnah. Okay, so they are later authorities, but they are also less authoritative. Okay, so a Baraita, I mean, and it's hard to sometimes know this when we're learning in English, right? But it's very clear whether something is Mishnaic material or Amoraic material by whether it's in Hebrew and Aramaic, right? So a Baraita is in Mishnaic Hebrew, okay, because Mishnaic Hebrew is a very specific dialect of Hebrew. A Baraita is in Mishnaic Hebrew, and it quotes Tanaim, but it does not appear in the codified Mishnah.
Okay.
Right. Essentially, I would say it was left on the cutting room floor.
Okay.
Right. But because it quotes Tanaim, it's as authoritative as a Mishnah.
Okay.
Right. Because what makes it authoritative is the rank of the authorities quoted.
Okay.
Right. And so Tanaim always trump Amoraim. Right. But I mean, the difference between a Baraita and a Mishnah is that you can discredit a Baraita by demonstrating that it's corrupt. right? You can't, a Mishnah, because it's a Mishnah, it can't be corrupt. It could possibly be misunderstood, but you can't say, oh, that's a, that's a counterfeit Mishnah. It can't be a counterfeit Mishnah. But you could have a counterfeit Baraita or a corrupted.
And how is that determined? What's the standard there?
Somebody in the Gemara says, no, that's I learned this different. Like you've seen this, right? Where we say I learned this differently. Because it's all oral, right?
Yeah.
It's all oral. But you have, and this is a little confusing because the guy who recites the Baraitas, because they're oral, but not everybody knows all the Baraitas, right? But there were people who were specially trained to know all the Baraitas, and they were called Tana also.
Okay.
Right? So they would be in the lesson, and a Tana would give over a Baraita. And if nobody raised an objection to it, then it was considered to be authentic. Right? And so somebody, in other words, like you have, let's say 2 generations later, somebody says, oh, that's a corrupted Baraita. And this other guy says, no, because I was in class and the Tana recited it this way, and my teacher didn't object, which he would have if it had been a corrupt Baraita.
Okay.
Oh, that's what a Baraita is.
Well,
All right.
I enjoyed this very much.
Right. I'm glad we were able to do it. Hopefully this was just a fluke, and I'll teach it anyway. If it's only you, I'll still teach it. But it would be nice.
Do you think some people might feel intimidated by the material? I do at times. It's very.
They might, but the thing is, we're getting into stuff that is much more directly related to the Seder.
Yeah.
And I'll go back and say, even if you think it's too hard, even if you think it's irrelevant, give it another shot, because we're getting into material that is much more directly connected to the Seder.
Right, and the Seder's creeps up on us every day, so
Spring
approaches. So. Okay.